Hi, Ollie.
Hi, Marcos. Nice to
Hello.
see you.
Likewise, and hello, everyone. So,
Hi, everyone.
I think we were going to talk about good charts this week. So,
Yes, we are. Well, not yes, or less worrying charts might be better.
yeah,
The very fact that you're visiting you can't be all good, really. But yes, one
yeah.
very
In a
promising.
medical situation of any kind is not going to be optimal. So, what we're going to look at is astrological charts of consultations, which when you look at, you think, oh, this will probably go well, or this will produce a good
Yes,
result.
yes,
So I've brought one this week, and you're going to bring one for the next
that's
episode.
right. Yes.
So we're just going to do the converse of what we did with our last episodes, looking at sort of flashing red charts. So, I mean, I guess, do we want to start in the same way that we did last time, with sort of outlining general features
Yeah,
of
yeah.
charts that
And
might be good?
then we can apply those. Good idea.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
I suppose one of the things I always do is look at the benefic planets as a classic one. Your
Yeah.
rather than see, um, well, assuming look at the malefic planets, Mars and Saturn, and if they're not looking too problematic, I think, well, that's good for a start. That's a good sign.
Yeah.
And then we look to things like Venus and Jupiter and see what they're doing, and are they applying to the right things in the right houses, etc. Yeah, it's how to put this. I mean,
Yeah, because there's so
basically,
many different
so,
factors you could list, aren't
yeah,
there? So it becomes,
but I think we can say that a well dignified, strong Venus and Jupiter, wherever it is likely to be good,
to be somewhat more helpful.
somewhat
Exactly.
more
And
helpful.
I think that the qualification, that maybe one of the main qualifications that we could inject, that you were sort of probably one of the things that was going through your mind there, was that so long as they don't rule the any of the naughty houses.
Right,
So
yes.
so
Yeah,
you know, Venus and Jupiter, particularly when they are strong and in quote unquote good houses, like on the angles, particularly the first or the 10th angle, or in good houses like the 11th or the 5th, or to a less extent the 3rd and ninth, will be helpful, so long as they don't rule the 6th, the 8th, or the 12th.
but as I understand it, if they're in the sixth, that can be a good thing.
Yeah, that this is always, I think so. I think they can. And I hope they can, because that is the case in my birth chart. So both of my benefics are in my sixth and eighth
Oh, wow,
houses,
right.
respectively. And my view on that is, if they don't rule difficult houses while being in those positions, they will tend to, rather than bringing many gifts to your table, they will alleviate problems.
Yes.
So they will sort of return you back to zero rather than raise you up high.
Yes.
But they'll still give you gifts. Now, if they're in those places and ruling difficult places, then they might dump you a little bit below zero sometimes. They'll still try and help, but they might also sometimes not try and help. They might
And
sometimes do the opposite.
and
So,
perhaps what might be even more useful is you've got a nice aspect from one of the benefics onto one of the problematic planets, sort of thing, which one absolutely
yes.
agree.
Well, more you. I don't know if it's, but yes, that would also be useful, definitely, wouldn't it? That would be a. I think Chris Brennan calls it bonification.
Yes.
You know, when you've got, particularly if you've got a naughty planet that is f- aspected in a friendly way by sextile or trine by a strong, or even not a strong benefic, by
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
benefic sort of like making them a bit nicer, or taking the edge off them a little bit, would be helpful. But we're talking about like optimal things. So you made the point about strong Venus and Jupiter, angular or in good
Yeah.
places in the chart, so long as, caveat, they don't rule the naughty houses.
Yes.
Um, I guess I might go with the ascendant ruler, the ruler of the
Yeah.
rising sign, and or the moon, but both of them being strong and in good houses. So you want the ascendant ruler and the moon, preferably both,
Yes. Yeah.
not to be in dodgy houses like the sixth,
Definitely.
the eighth, or the 12th, and to be in good shape. You know, so be in a sign that they enjoy being in, not to be in any hard aspect with one of the malefics or the other malefic if the ascendant ruler is itself a malefic. Not to be retrograde. Obviously, the moon can't be retrograde, but the ascendant ruler can be if it's not the moon. Or the sun. But anyway, the general vibe there
And,
is you want the ascendant ruler and the moon to be
and
strong.
is it Lily
And
or Culpepper says if you want the the ascendant planetary ruler to be stronger than the ruler of the sixth house? So the
yes, yes,
I'm not quite sure what, maybe they both say it, but that's always a good sign, isn't it? If you've got
yes.
strength in the ascendant planet rather than the
That's a very good point because that obviously means that the patient is stronger than the disease,
yes.
which is what you want to see, definitely. Should we slightly? I mean, obviously we can't do this in great detail now, given the time limitations. But could we describe a little bit what we mean by strong? So some of the
Yeah.
factors.
Yeah, so planetary strength, I mean, the two basic ones are essential dignity, which is if the planet is in its rulership or exaltation generally. There's a few more minor dignities as well, but
Which can stack up and
and I
themselves are
suppose
all
triplicities
important,
and
but they're
stuff can
less
all
powerful.
stack up. But yes, but those two are particularly good. And also accidental dignity, which is being on one of the stakes, being in the first, seventh, tenth, or fourth house.
Yes, but there is this finesse point where Ptolemy thought that houses above the earth were a bit more powerful than those below it, all else being equal, because one is in daylight, the other is in the realm of the
Yeah,
underworld. So see the symbolism. So he would say 10th is the strongest, then the
yeah,
first,
yeah.
and then instead of going to the seventh and fourth, he would then say the 11th
Which is
and
really
then the
interesting. Yeah,
seventh, then the fourth, which is interesting, isn't it? Because
it
he's sort of
is.
prioritizing that the sun climbing up to its
Yeah.
peak as being above the setting place, and then the IC in terms of power. And then after the fourth, he might go to the fifth, which is,
Right.
the next succeedent below the
Yeah.
horizon, but still a
Yeah.
fortunate house. Then he would go to, and only then do we start to hit the succeedent houses. And I've seen this done different ways by different authors. So some authors would then go second house and eighth house, but some go ninth and
Yeah.
third, and only then second, eighth, 12th, and the sixth being
I've
the
noticed
worst in
that,
terms of power.
particularly with the ninth house, you think, well, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, so I mean, well, on the way I've seen it talked about by some horror astrologers, which I generally agree with, is that the third and ninth, because they're so-called cadent houses, they're falling away.
Yes.
They are weak in terms of sort of power
Yeah.
and timing. They can either do things really fast, generally when you don't want them done fast, and they can do things really, really slow when you want them done fast. That's usually how the cadent
Right.
houses
Yeah.
work. If you want to go quickly, you can't because you haven't got the power. And if you want it to happen slowly, it'll fall right into your lap because you don't have the power to stop it. So cadent houses are the weakest in terms of that sort of thing. But the third and ninth did have this traditional sort of feeling of being a bit more fortunate, a bit more
Yes.
auspicious. So it's sort of like weak but auspicious. It's like the ninth house, the house of religion. It's like being a member of the church. Yeah, you
Yeah.
couldn't, you had to be celibate and you had to live this monastic life, and like you didn't really have any conventional social clout, but the church was really powerful as
Yes.
well. It had a lot. So it's that weird little, I think
Agreed.
that was the idea. You're sort of sequestered away and without power in many ways, but you still have like the third and the ninth still have this weird power, more so in a way than the eighth and the second. So
Yeah.
this is all
Yeah.
finessing and whatever, and so we've gone on a huge tangent. But the point there is that if your ascendant ruler and your moon are in the angular houses, or perhaps the two succeedants, the that being the 11th and the fifth, and then to a
Agreed.
much lesser extent the ninth or third,
Yes.
then they've got some clout. You don't really want them in particularly the eighth, the sixth, or the 12th.
Yeah. Yeah. And yes, you don't, and you don't
Yes.
really want the malefics in any of those houses. So that's going to make life difficult. But yeah. Anyway, but let's stick to the good news.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll default into the. We're medical astrologers, folks. Of course, we're going to look for the naughty stuff. That's what we do. But shall we? Shall I
Yeah.
get my little
Let's have a
example
look at the
chart out?
chart now. Yes. With the
Yeah, 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 yes. Right. Okay. So this is the
right. Let me just.
chart, and this was a consultation chart for a client patient I saw, as you can see, in 2023. And this was a client who came in with they'd had arthritis in their hands and feet for many years. diagnosed osteoarthritis, which is just sometimes called wear and tear, which it actually isn't. It's a bit more complicated than that. Um, but then I think lately, in the non too distant past, in the sort of previous couple of months, they'd started having intense inflammatory attacks that affected mainly the feet and hands, but also given them lots of muscle pain, pain in their
Right.
back in the right side, to the point that they couldn't move, and they were very sudden onset. They registered the pain as 9 up to almost 10 out of 10, like the maximum it could
Right.
be.
Horrid. Yes.
Lasted maybe 48 to 76 hours. And so they've gone and had a bunch of blood tests, and the blood tests has revealed very elevated inflammatory factors like CRP, ESR. These are just blood test results showing inflammation, but also some specific autoimmune markers were raised, and those were anti-nuclear antibodies, which is suggestive of lupus, and
Right.
also rheumatoid factors suggested of rheumatoid arthritis. So anyway, long story long, we made a sort of working diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis, of lupus, beg pardon, just based on a
Hmm.
few other things that were going on. They didn't have the classic butterfly rash on the face, but it was just suggestive. There were other things from the history that might have suggested that. But so after the consultation, I looked at the chart for the consultation. Now, this was a client coming for herbal medicine. They weren't coming for astrology, but I always note the time of the consultation and have a look at it. And I was very encouraged by this chart. Now, is the chart perfect? No, no chart is. Just as even the worst chart is very rarely utterly awful. There's always mitigations in bad charts, and there's always cruddy things in good charts. So the only cruddy thing in this chart, I would say, is the Saturn being in the seventh house,
Right.
which is the house of the therapist or or their partner. So I thought, oh, that may mean I do a bad job. Or here's Saturn's in Pisces, which is a double-bodied sign, um, which means there may be more than one physician involved.
Right.
Uh, and which was certainly the case because obviously they were seeing their rheumatologist as well as me,
Right.
and presumably some other healthcare people as well. Saturn's not terrible here. Saturn in the first 10 degrees of Pisces is in face. It has minor dignity and it's a daytime chart, but it's still not great. But the thing I'm sure you noticed immediately, Ollie, and to your earlier point, the thing that's fabulous is we have Venus in
Yes.
Taurus on the
I
midheaven
did notice that. Yes.
ruling the medicine with the North Node. So this
Oh,
is
super
like
powerful.
medicines are
Yes.
bloody fantastic. So this is like very encouraging when you're going to be treating someone. And the other thing that was good was the ascendant ruler. We've got Leo rising, and the ascendant ruler was the sun having just gone into Aries
Wonderful.
here.
It's exalted in Aries, isn't it?
Yes, in its exaltation and also in its triplicity in a daytime chart in a fire sign. So very strong sun. And incidentally, the ninth house, although it's one of the cadent houses, a lucky cadent house, like we mentioned before, so it's somewhat weak. It's also a house that the sun really likes being
Oh,
in.
it
The sun
joys
is
in it,
said to,
doesn't it? Yes.
yeah, it's said to joy in the ninth house. So I was very encouraged by that.
Yes.
The moon, which is a secondary significator of the patient, isn't doing so good. It's in the last degree of Pisces, which means it's on the star Shiat, which is not so good. I always say it is what it sounds like. But the fortunate thing is the moon is about to move out of Pisces and conjoin the sun, which new moons are often difficult, but in this case, because of the dignity of the sun and its placement in that ninth house where it likes being, I would see that as a reception of the moon. It's sort of alleviating perhaps some of those difficulties. And what made me think that double is that the moon here ruled the 12th house, which amongst other significations is the feet, and was in Pisces, a
Oh,
sign
yes.
signifying the feet. And a lot of the pains that this person had been experiencing was in the feet, the feet and the hands.
Right, right,
But
right.
and on this crappy star Shiat, and also with the planet Neptune, which may imply that there's some chemical sensitivity involved here, perhaps, or some allergic trigger involved. Don't know, but it was like moving out of away from that sort of conjunction with Shiat, and then towards that conjunction of the Sun, which I felt was more positive. But yeah, so the most encouraging thing was I felt that that Venus, that very strong Venus on the midheaven representing good medicine. So in terms of what happened, I prescribed plants mainly of the Sun and of Venus, because I wanted to strengthen the ascendant ruler, the Sun, and I wanted to use that Venus ruling the midheaven, because Culpeper says if the Lord of the 10th is strong, use their medicines, you know. So Venus and the Sun for sure. And I threw in a few Mercury ruled plants because of the hands and feet being affected, and Mercury, you know, ruling the hands and feet. I think we did 3 weeks of a herbal mix. And if anyone's curious, herbalisty types, I think the first mix was just a tincture with chamomile, ground ivy, agrimony, feverfew, and celery seed. And if anyone's double curious about the humoral diagnosis, which we made from the chart, I think I've written down somewhere here, was it was mostly phlegm with some melancholy. There was outward choler, so the outward symptom was inflammation, but inwardly there was a lot of phlegm and then a bit of melancholy. So we wanted mostly warming herbs, but not too heating. So the prescription needed to expel heat a little bit. But anyway, just gave 3 weeks of that, and then a suggestion to take high doses of evening primrose oil, which is, I think, evening primrose is a herb of the sun, and very high in GLA, gamma linoleic acid. Not as high, interestingly, as borage seed oil, but it does cut inflammation a little bit. It interrupts an inflammatory pathway for producing some inflammatory prostaglandins. So anyway, they went away, did that. We saw them again. They followed up, like, I think 2 months later, and they'd only done the 3 weeks of tincture, which is pretty classic. You know, you say to people, come back in 2 weeks. They come back 2 months later and they've been off the medicine for like 4 weeks. And you're like, ah. But their response to the medicine had been excellent. They've been very compliant for that 3 weeks.
Right.
They'd taken the medicine diligently within the 3 weeks at least, and they'd carried on with evening primrose. And at the follow-up, even though they hadn't had any medicine for a month, the progress was the pain was reduced. It was less continuous. The pain in their right side had resolved completely. There was a slight increase in active range of motion in the shoulders. Their sleep was better. There was no change yet in the upper limit of the pain. It could still go up to about 5 out of 10, but they hadn't had any more of those crazy attacks. The pain that they were left with was only the sort of residual osteoarthritic pain in the hands and feet, which they said could get as bad as around 5 out of 10. But they haven't had any of that 10 out of 10 intense crazy pain at all. And they still had a slight cough and some headaches, which was interesting. And they'd had a few sweats, night sweats, which was interesting. So all we did was tweaked the prescription. I think we redid it as a tea because they were like, we can't afford to keep taking the tincture because tinctures are a bit more expensive. So what I tend to do in those cases is just prescribe a DIY tea. I give the patient the recipe and say, you fill this out. I kept the same herbs, sort of chamomile, ground ivy, agrimony, feverfew, celery seed, and just added a bit of sage, because that's a nice herb that will reduce night sweats and just generally reduce inflammation a bit, and a bit of licorice.
Quick question on ground ivy. That's an interesting choice. It's not one I usually would use.
I love ground ivy. Ground ivy is amazing. Glaucoma heterosea. It's a herb of Venus, according to Culpeper, and I'd agree with him. It has these little purple flowers and
sort of a head thing, sort of stuff.
Yes, yes, perfect. Is it in the Botticelli painting? Are they doing, or is that ordinary ivy? Or
you know, I saw that there's some just this spring, and I thought, God, there's so many bloody herbs.
I'm not sure that they do even. I may have just invented that. I may have auto-edited that into the painting in my brain.
Number of herbs there, so it's quite a high chance. Anyway, but for this particular patient, why ground ivy?
Well, ground ivy is. Culpeper talks about it being good for expelling both choler and melancholy, and he refers to it mainly as a herb for inflammation in the guts, in the bowels. But also for lung and respiratory tract inflammation. But it also talks about it being really good for pains in the hands, feet, and hips and gout. Really? And I found it to be really useful for that sort of reactive arthritis, particularly if it's a multi-systemic thing where they've got inflammation in the guts or in the respiratory tract and in the joints at the same time.
Wow. Okay.
So it's a fascinating herb, and it's the triterpenoids and ursolic acid, oleanolic acid, which are sometimes these triterpenoids are slightly steroidally structured, so they often have anti-inflammatory activities. Lots of flavonoids, as you might imagine, for something in the lavender mint family. so antioxidanty things, and a little bit of essential oil. And according to this very old Potter's Herbal Cyclopedia, it says ursolic and olenolic acid inhibit Epstein-Barr activation induced by the inflammatory tumor promoter, something, 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 and one of the hydroxyoctodecadenoic acid derivatives was found to be a partial agonist at prostaglandin E1 and D2 receptors. Anti-inflammatory activity of the whole herb extract has also been demonstrated using the rat paw edema test. So, I mean, this is very old, but the point is there's actually significant modulation of inflammatory processes in
Wow.
that plant.
Okay.
And what I liked about it in call pepper is it's a hot, dry herb that cleared, reduced choler. So it's hot and dry, but it also reduces heat as well as reducing melancholy. It's one of the herbs that reduces melancholy, and it also heats the spleen.
Right.
And in this chart, I would have got from this chart that this patient has a cold spleen. But I mean, certainly symptom wise, that prescription, it's a sort of mixture of plants with anti-inflammatory activity that would also be somewhat anodyne or pain relieving, and just modulate a lot of the symptoms. And it worked remarkably well. That second tea prescription, I also added some turmeric to take as golden milk, just because it's cheaper than the tablets.
Yeah.
And they disappeared off into the night, and I didn't hear from them again. And this, what was fascinating about this is a person who was smoking quite a lot. Their diet wasn't great, but the response from the plants was very notable and very positive. So that was really good. I don't know if there's much else to say about this chart, really. Just, I guess, yeah.
I think but fascinating. That
Well, it is interesting. There's one more. I guess there's one more point I can make, which is just to look briefly at where the ascendant ruler is headed. And what's great about this is we've got the ascendant ruler, the sun, is heading towards a conjunction of Jupiter in the ninth. Now, that could be really good or really bad because Jupiter is the ruler of the fifth house of good fortune, but also the ruler of the eighth house of death. So it's one of those where you have to really carefully judge and weigh these things up. In this chart, I would almost certainly say it's a good thing because Jupiter here is making an aspect to the fifth house, a trine aspect. It beholds the fifth, doesn't behold the eighth. And also Jupiter enjoys being in the ninth house. It's Jupiter's natural house. And the sun is very strong. So there's a sense in which, that heading towards Jupiter is more likely to be a positive.
Just a note for our more herbally than astrology viewers is that the sun won't hit Mercury first, as Mercury rides ahead of the sun in this instance.
Yes, and in fact, one might, yes, that's a really good point, Ollie. And one might say Mercury is doing something called translating the light of the sun to Jupiter, as Mercury is separating from the sun. If we step it back a few days, you can see Mercury conjoined the sun in Pisces. And then when Mercury stepped into Aries, Mercury will keep steaming ahead and then join Jupiter. So Mercury is fulfilling his natural role as a messenger here, just traversing between the sun and Jupiter. So that's like a sort of go-between will introduce the sun to Jupiter, which in this case is probably quite positive. Although there is that slight element of a shadow because of the Jupiter ruling the eighth. But I think in this chart, Jupiter's definitely doing its duty as a more positive planet overall, I think, just because of the sun. Now, if that translation, if Jupiter and the sun were both still in Pisces in the eighth house, I might be a bit worried, or say they were in the sixth house in Capricorn, I'd be very worried about that. But yeah, they're not. So,
brilliant.
Anyway, right, I'll stop sharing. Do you have just any final comments on that chart, Ollie, at all?
No, I'm not really. I mean, one question actually, Marcus. I mean, because it's something I don't use at all at the moment, and it's just I noticed the part of fortune is bang on the ascendant. Do you take note of that in your
Yes and no. I mean, the part of fortune and the part of spirit, which is the one below it, will always be on the ascendant at a new moon.
Right.
So that's just an artifact of the new moon in a sense. I do the part of fortune can sometimes show a body part or a thing which is important in a horary thing. So here this
Okay.
might say the person's heart. I mean, same as the ascendant would do really. It's not massively afflicted, which is promising. Um, so yes, and I need to play a bit more with it, because if the part of fortune is afflicted, it will often show a body part which is under stress. If it's
Right. Okay. So
um,
it's always
you
worth having
know,
a look.
yeah, it's kind of a composite point between the sun, the moon, and the ascendant. So between the patient's body, their vitality, and then, I mean, the body could be the moon and the ascendant. So it always says something about a body part that's important for that
Right.
person in some
Okay.
way in this scenario you're talking about. But I mean, in this case, I didn't pay much attention to it because A, it's not afflicted, and B, it's a new moon, so it's going to be on the ascendant anyway. So
And the only other point I have again is, do you think that Saturn the seventh might be one of the reasons that this patient really never came back? Really, it was like okay, he's fixed me, but like, I don't really like this sort of stuff.
could be. I mean, I felt that that the patient had good rapport. I felt that maybe cost was an issue for them.
Right, and that could,
Um,
right, that could.
and I think I don't want to give away
No, of
too
course
much of
not.
the personal thing, but let me refresh my memory, because I think socially they had a pretty good social life, but there were some, I don't know. I felt like their issue with their current partner was good, but I think they'd been previously married and there'd been some difficulties with that.
Right, okay, and that might be a
So
contributor.
that may also, I think it might be a both and. I mean, I think, to say, Saturn here is probably doing more than double duty as a significator, and so it might be suggesting, okay, there may be some reservations about the practitioner here, whether that was me or whether it was the doctors, or I don't know, or it may also be describing some difficulties. To answer that question, though, I don't see a negative aspect between the seventh ruler and the first ruler. But you are
Right,
quite right in that the first ruler in Aries, it is in the fall of Saturn.
yeah,
So it may be this person was like, oh, I don't really want to go back and see them. But that's, who knows? That's
who knows?
the impression I got from them, was that they really appreciated the herbal medicine, and they were quite up for it. They didn't want to make any major changes, but they were they just wanted everything to be done by the medicine. But fortunately, in this case, that seemed to be somewhat doable.
There you go.
So
Brilliant.
yeah. But yeah,
That,
no, that's a very good point, Ollie, because the fly in the ointment is, one of the flies in the ointment is definitely that Saturn, which rules the six. And it made me wonder, because it's tying in the seventh and the sixth, is that illness perhaps related to previous relationship difficulties and hang out
right, yeah,
emotional
yeah,
issues
yeah.
from that, or stress from that previous relationship. And then of course the other tricky planet in the chart is definitely the Mars, just because it's a daytime chart and Mars is usually a bit naughty, and Mars is in the 11th, not really directly beating anything up, but there is a square through the Antitia to the Sun from Mars, because Mars's Antition is on 1 degree 52 of Cancer. So
Uh,
it's like there is
yeah,
this
yeah,
hidden square from Mars.
yeah. 'Cause
Yeah.
I didn't. Yeah, because I was, of course, thinking, yeah, the sun's just escaped Mars. It's nipped into
Yeah,
Aries.
I mean, fortunately, the Sun in Aries is obviously ruled by Mars, so it's kind
Right.
of like that square to Mars won't, that invisible square to Mars won't hurt it as much. But there is this sense of, because the patient's hands and feet were, and Gemini is the hands and the arms,
Yeah, yeah.
that Mars is definitely a factor. It's saying, look, there's this outward irritation, these inflammatory factors in the blood, because Mars is in an air sign,
Yes.
and that might be related to, and the patient was coughing a lot, that might be related to the lungs, because you've got Scorpio and the IC ruled by Mars. I mean, we could go deeper into the chart, but all in all, I mean, this was a pretty positive chart,
No,
and
I
it
mean,
seems to turn out that way. And in terms of why the patient didn't come back, maybe the Saturn in the seventh traditional, but we've also got the pretty prominent Uranus there in the 10th. And I often find when you have
yeah.
Uranus angular, it's not right on the angle, it's approaching the angle, it's not
Mhm.
exactly squaring the ascendant descendant, it's sort of halfway between the square of the ascendant descendant conjunction and the midheaven.
Yeah.
um, but it's elevated and it's approaching the midheaven, and whenever you see Uranus prominent, it usually indicates some degree of instability or
Yeah,
unpredictability in the
yeah,
situation. And often the person, it can in the 10th, it can indicate the person choosing or favoring alternative treatments over conventional ones. They can also indicate a certain degree of instability in the course of treatment, or sort of like radical changes and stuff like that.
yeah.
So yeah, maybe
Fascinating.
that. But as far as I know, they took their herbal formula and were quite happy to. They took one delivery of the tea and then carried on self-supplying and rode off into the night. So I think,
Brilliant. Just what one
that was
wants.
that.
Big tick.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
brilliant. Marcos, thank you so much for sharing that. That was absolutely very, very interesting. It's always nice to hear success stories as well, isn't it? Give us.
Likewise. Yeah. No. Thanks, Ollie. I'm looking forward to hearing yours next time, because it's interesting. It's always interesting seeing how other practitioners, how other practitioners deal with cases, but also just seeing the astrology. It's
Yeah,
fascinating just
no,
seeing
it is.
how it sort of plays out. Um, anyway, right,
All right.
brilliant. Hope you've enjoyed that, folks,
Till
and
next time.
see you next
Thank you
time.
very much. Bye
Bye.
bye.